Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
While the number of irreligious individuals in America grows, there's still much that is not generally known about those of us who live without religion. Now, this may begin with questions of demography and identity that are focused on who we are and what we believe. It soon becomes a question about how we, the godless, are perceived and treated in the world as it is today. The extent and harm of social stigma and discrimination, as well as legal bias, need to be understood before the work of building an effective secular society can begin. Here to help us understand some of these issues is Allison Gill. Allison is the Vice President for Legal and Policy at American Atheists, where she frequently produces reports on just these questions. Allison, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me.
It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Allison, for coming on. Looking forward to talking with you. Just to get started, can you tell us about your own religious background and how you came to work with American Atheists?
Sure. So I've never really been a religious person. My family was a little bit more religious. My father was sort of a lapsed Catholic, and my mother was a whatever is popular that week, sort of Protestant. So she went to all sorts of like Methodist, Presbyterian, mainline different places, but infrequently. Always tried to drag me along, but I always objected. So
Right.
I've never really been religious. And since I've been old enough to make my own choices, I haven't really gone to. I have not really been active in religion. And however, when I became a teenager and later in my 20s, I got more involved with following up, the secular movement. I was always a big fan of a lot of the authors involved and a lot of the debates. I think I've watched, God, I don't know, so many years of atheist experience and that sort of thing back years ago.
Yeah.
So I've always been interested in the movement, but not really engaged in it. And after law school, I began to get a lot more engaged in advocacy, mostly with regard to LGBTQ issues. And there was a time when, the American Atheist was looking for someone with a legal background to help run their advocacy programs. And I thought it was an amazing opening and got more involved.
That's fantastic. Well, let's then talk a little bit about American Atheists. Can you give a quick overview of the work that they do and what the organization focuses on?
Sure. American Atheists is actually a really old atheist organization, one of the first founded. We were founded in the 1960s by Madalyn Murray O'Hair after she won her case at the Supreme Court involving prayer in schools. So we've been around for quite a while. Of course, there was, periods of instability, let's say, after
Mhm.
the death of O'Hare. However, the organization's been engaged in legal and advocacy work for decades, and in our current iteration, we have a legal office in Washington D.C. and we engage in both litigation to protect the separation of religion and government, and also advocacy work at both the state and federal level. Since I started with the organization in 2018, I've really shifted our advocacy agenda to focus on the states because there's a lack of advocacy happening in the states, even though that's where the majority of policies and laws are made in our country. And so we were able to play a really important role there, pushing back against the efforts of Christian nationalists in the states and also advancing positive policy measures.
Mm. American Atheists, do they sort of stand alone on this, or are there connections and partnerships with other atheist, secular, or humanist groups?
We work with a lot of terrific atheist, secular, and humanist groups. For example, we work with the Freedom from Religion Foundation on state level work and federal level work, and we also work with Americans United for separation of religion and government. They do a lot of the state tracking as well. I would say that we're probably the leaders when it comes to certain aspects of it, especially state work. But especially when it comes to federal work, for example, we work with the Secular Coalition for America. So it really does differ. Every organization has their own sort of niche.
Yeah. I'm starting to see how the pieces fit together here. So, are you? Is it predominantly legal work that you focus on? Well, certainly you do as the legal and policy.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, we do legal work, but we also do, advocacy is not always legal work. A lot of it is lobbying, producing resources, getting our advocates on the ground engaged, doing things like grassroots outreach, working with our field team. So, it's not all legal work, but sort of legal work and advocacy go hand in hand. And we like to have a strategy that combines both so that we're working together in a way that makes sense.
Hmm. And yeah, talking about those resources, that the information that you provide, reality check, which is the non-religious survey in America, is one that I think Nathan and I have wanted to talk about for almost a year now. Could you, I don't, Nathan, can you start us off on this one? I'm not sure where to begin.
Yeah, just to ask if you could give us sort of the some of the key takeaways from the report. I mean, I guess it was a couple, maybe it was in 2020 that it came out.
Yes, I'm happy to talk more about it. So, as we're doing advocacy work, I came from the LGBTQ movement, and one of the things I had worked on for years when it came to the LGBTQ movement is at making sure that federal surveys collect data about LGBTQ people, because for until we made it happen, most federal surveys did not collect any information about LGBTQ people. And if you don't have federal surveys collecting data, then they basically are invisible, right? For policy making, for advocacy, for lawmakers to consider what the needs are of those communities. Well, it turns out that non-religious people are in much the same situation as LGBTQ people were when it comes to data. There's almost no federal surveys that collect any data about non-religious people, or for that matter, religious minorities. And without that kind of data, all the situations and disparities that our communities face are masked. Like, we just don't know. Like, we know non-religious young people face bullying and harassment at elevated rates, but we don't know how elevated, right? And that's just one example. It affects healthcare. It affects employment. It affects housing. All these things are affected, yet we have no stats on them. And so, as soon as I began and American Atheists and noticed these huge gaps in our knowledge, began pushing to sort of do better data collection. And this first report, Reality Check, is really the culmination of those efforts. We did what's called the U.S. Secular Survey, a survey of nearly 34,000 non-religious people all across the country in 2019. And we published the first report from that survey, Reality Check, in 2020. And so this report, it pulls all that terrific data together. I mean, 34,000 people is a huge sample. So we have really, really good data. And we can talk about what's important to non-religious people, where they face discrimination and stigma, and all sorts of other matters as well.
34,000, that's a pretty large sample, isn't it?
It's a huge sample. It's huge, which is really great. And it really shows also the level of interest from our community. When we were first proposing this, I was thinking we had what's called a survey period. I think we wanted to keep it open for a month, like a full month, and we were hoping to get 5 to 10,000 people
Wow.
respond,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
we beat 10,000 in the first 8 hours.
Wow.
Oh wow,
We
wow.
ended up cutting short the survey period because you actually pay by the response, and
Oh
we
right,
overrode
okay.
our budget twice. We did an
Wow.
emergency fundraiser to get more money so we could keep
Wow,
going.
Yeah.
wow.
But and then also, we had a few open-ended questions on there, right? So we asked people about what their experiences are with sort of making other people that they're aware that they're an atheist, and also, did they experience any sort of discrimination? And about a third of people submitted stories in one or both of those questions. So it's over 12,000 responses. And if you know anything about surveys, you know that most people do not answer
Yeah.
open-ended questions.
Right, right, yeah, right.
So
Yes.
that's amazing. And it just goes to show how people are thirsting, and our community are thirsting to be heard, to get the word out and have people listen to what they have to say. So,
So most of the research we've seen, aside from this, is about nuns, and nuns are a very, very broad category.
mhm.
But how did people in this survey identify?
Sure. This is not a survey about nuns, and I want to be very explicit about that. So, nuns are people that are what are called religiously non-identified, and that's done by several different surveying organizations, including PRRI and Pew. And those are people that basically don't pick a different category, and they just sort of fall into this none category. Some of those people are non-religious and identify as atheists or agnostics, about somewhere between 9 and 11%. However, the majority of them are religious. Like if you ask them, they say religion is very important to me. They say that they believe in a God. I mean, that's not non-religious.
Yeah.
Right, right,
Yeah.
yes.
The way that we've identified people for this survey is they have to identify with one or more non-religious labels, which include atheist, agnostic, humanist, skeptic, secular, non-religious. Those are just some. There might be others, but those are just the main ones. So if you agree that you are those labels describe you, then you qualify for this survey. So it's a very different type of survey.
Yeah. So we're looking at atheists, agnostics, at least in our like general terminology, people who identify with the title of this podcast. It's people in this sort of atheist mindset. What did you
Mhm.
find about the political priorities? What is important to atheists?
Well, first of all, the report is available at secularsurvey.org. That's secularsurvey.org. And when it comes to what's important, like policy priorities, we asked this in really two different ways. First of all, we asked what policy priorities are important to you. And then we also asked what are your top three that non religious organizations, like advocacy organizations like American Atheists, should pursue as priorities. And so, each of the policy priorities we identified, most people said were very important. And those include things like maintaining secular public schools, stopping the denial of health care based on religious beliefs, access to abortion and contraception, opposing religious exemptions that allow for discrimination, comprehensive and medically accurate sex education, protecting the environment and addressing climate change, protecting youth from religion based harm, stopping inappropriate political activity by churches, LGBTQ equality, preventing public funding of religious schools, persecution of non religious people internationally, and also opposing religious displays on public property. So, those are all the issues that we looked at. And the three highest that most people said were something that non religious organizations should focus on are maintaining secular public schools, opposing religious exemptions that allow for discrimination, and access to abortion and contraception. So there are a few other close ones, but those were the top three. And surprisingly, guess what the lowest one was?
Oh,
I I think it was the if I remember right, it was the preventing the religious monument or religious displays in public lands.
That is exactly right.
wow.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
that's the stereotype about what non-religious people want
Right.
Yeah,
is we're
Yeah.
always
Right.
after, flags on land or whatever. But that's actually, I mean, it's not saying it's not important to people. It is, but it's also at the bottom of the list with a lot of really important priorities.
Yeah. Right.
yeah, yeah. That was actually I was just interested to ask about that because it, like you said, like it is sort of in the stereotypical view, I guess, like that's one of the sort of bread and butter issues. But I mean, I wonder if there's been a shift, like in the atheist movement, to focus on away from like less. Those are more symbolic issues, I think, like to more maybe to more impactful ones. I'm not sure. Do you think there is a shift like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that people are indicating that they want a shift, right? I think here they're saying basically these are the issues that are more important, and that's the issue that's less important. However, also I think it's important to keep in mind that for I don't know what 60 years, while the atheist movement has been going on, we've been winning legal victories and sort of trying to maintain those victories. And some of the victories that are probably easiest to fight for are, well, this monument is on public land, and the court has said you can't do that. You're doing it. So it's sort of became, I mean, it's sort of very black and white, but that became synonymous with what atheist activism is. And that's what people thought about it, even though it's not what's most important to people, if that makes sense. And over time, based on, unfortunately, where the courts are going, even those victories are definitely in jeopardy or have been overruled.
Right, yes.
So it also sounds like there's a bit of a generational shift in there. So, like, are there major differences between the older generation of atheists who maybe focus on that and younger atheist Americans?
I'm so glad you asked that question because we actually produced two separate additional reports in addition to the main reality check report. One focusing on non-religious young people, and one focusing on Black non-religious Americans, and they're both available at secularsurvey.org. And we're actually working on three additional reports currently that will be coming out this year. One on non-religious women, one on LGBTQ non-religious people, and one on non-religious people in rural areas.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
so I'm pretty excited about those. But on the site, if you take a look about what's important to younger non-religious people, there are some differences with regard to what policy priorities they consider most important. Both groups selected, maintaining secular public schools as a top priority. However, youth also expressed a strong preference for protecting youth from religious-based harm. So I guess there's some level of
Mm.
self-interest there,
Yeah.
and
Right,
and
yes.
also protecting the environment and addressing climate change. So climate change was much more so important to young people. And I have to admit, maybe as I don't know, I wouldn't say I'm an older atheist, but a middle, someone in her
Yeah.
40s who's an
Uh-huh.
atheist,
Mhm.
I had never thought about climate change as an atheist issue,
Right?
right?
Yeah.
Right,
But
yes.
like if that's what people are saying is important to them as an atheist issue, and some of the arguments against climate change or stopping climate change are certainly religious in origin, then it's something that we have to think about and consider. So I think it's really interesting to think about those different perspectives.
Yeah. And how are they demographically different? Do we see changes in the racial or gendered composition?
Absolutely, we do. Yes. Well, to be clear, this is what's called a convenience sample. So the demographics from the report do not necessarily reflect the demographics for all non-religious people in the country. So I want to be really clear about that. I can just talk about differences within the sample. I can't sort of extrapolate. However, in our sample, the younger population is significantly more likely to be, of different races and ethnicities. So it's more diverse, and also significantly more likely to be trans or gender nonconforming. Young people ages 25, 18 to 25 were 3.5 times about as likely to be trans or gender nonconforming. More likely to
3.4
be LGBT.
times?
Yeah, more likely to be LGBTQ in general. It was about 25% for the full sample and about 45% for the to be LGBTQ for the young people sample.
Yeah, yeah. That was like I remember Todd and I reading the report some time ago, and that was a number that really jumped out at us. Like almost half of the young people were LGBTQ. What do you what do you take away from that?
Well, sure. Well, first of all, it's not surprising because, in the general population, when you look at age, the number of young people identifying as LGBTQ is significantly higher than it has been in previous generations. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. People are more likely to be able to express identities. People are coming to terms with, identities that before they might have masked or concealed or not been aware of. Um, so that's already happening. And I think this is just reflecting that change. And also, non-religious communities, I don't know how to frame this, but LGBTQ people are much, much, much more likely to be non-religious than other populations. I think it's something like 50% of LGBTQ people are religiously unaffiliated. So it's not surprising to see that we have a large sample size of LGBTQ people in our data.
I think we're going to come to biases later, but maybe just to mention it here, is that a result of like religious oppression? Is that the driving factor there?
I think it goes hand in hand, certainly. I mean, there's religious oppression. LGBTQ people are certainly affected by it, as are non religious people. I think people sometimes, when they face that kind of oppression, do end up having religious trauma, not being interested in pursuing organized religion, or sort of divorcing themselves from it, or being forced out. So there's definitely a connection there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just staying on the subject of like the non-religious youth report, say about half of young Americans, so like 18 to 24, are non-religious. But do you think this is going to change? Like, will they basically will they stay non-religious as they get older? Do you think?
So to be clear, they're religiously unaffiliated,
Okay,
Mhm.
right. Okay, that's a good point.
not
Right,
non-religious.
right,
And I
right.
mean, although the rates of being non-religious are significantly higher as well, it's hard to say. I mean, this is not. It's the first time we're seeing this in our population. So how do I say what's going to happen in the future, right? It would require a massive change in what's been happening for the past, 3 to 4 decades for things to really change dramatically. And I don't see that happening, particularly when religion is ever more so being used to oppress people in our country. I mean, that's what's a major driver here, right? So I don't see it happening, but anything is possible, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Um, I mean, it's certainly what the Christian nationalists and others would want. It's why we see such an effort to focus on schools, right, and to get as much religious symbolism in schools as possible.
So this survey is really just a snapshot. There's not really much past work that we can compare it to, and it doesn't tell us anything about what's moving into the future. But does it tell us how active young atheists are these days?
It does. It tells us a little bit about. We asked questions about, rate of voting, and participation in elections and registration of vote. It's a little bit tricky when we look at the younger ages because they may not have been able to register to vote at the prior election, and people tend to register. So it's a little bit tricky to sort of look at those numbers. But for atheists in general are remarkably participatory in democracy compared to most other groups. And Ryan Burge has actually done a lot of work on this. He's a researcher that's studied this quite a bit. And if you look at the political engagement numbers in Reality Check, about nearly 95% of survey respondents were registered to vote. 87% voted in 2016, and about 87% always or nearly always vote. So, to give you a comparison, it's not directly comparable, but the average general voting age population, about 55.7% vote. So, if we just compare directly, that's 30 points higher?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
It's
Right.
even higher, frankly, than the evangelicals, which are notorious for voting in high
Hmm.
levels. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So, if we can get organized, we have the power I mean, we have the ability to build political power and to sort of create a block, particularly when there's so much alignment on, interests and beliefs.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
are they
Yeah.
did this survey find that they're engaged in other more like social political activist groups, not necessarily just electoral politics?
Yes, we also did look at involvement with secular organizations, both at the national and local level. We didn't look at like other types of, civic organizations. We looked at secular organizations, so like, a local free thought group, or something along those lines, or national groups like American Atheists. And we found that there was quite a bit of engagement and looking at that, both, I think about 22% were engaged with local secular organizations of our sample, so more than 1 in 5. And they engage in lots of different types of activities, ranging from social opportunities to debates, volunteering, advocacy, etc. So we have some really good numbers on those sorts of things.
Yeah. Just going back to the point you were making a little bit ago about the potential of this group to be sort of a political voting bloc, given how high they do participate in elections. But how can they become a force? Like after the recent presidential election, like Todd and I wrote this article just saying, sort of making the point that non-religious people were a similar size to white evangelicals, and obviously who formed the basis of like the Republican Party, really. But I mean, like the Democrats aren't really courting, or don't seem to be courting, this equivalent size group of non-religious people. So I'm wondering, like, how do you think that could happen? That this sort of group could be turned into a more sort of to flex its political muscles, I guess.
That's a great question. And to be clear, it is starting to happen, right? It's going to take time. I mean, the religious right really gained prominence. I was about to say 40 years ago when Ronald Reagan came in office, but it was actually before that. It was, 50 to 60 years ago. That's when they really began to start organizing. So it's going to take time. And we're not as well organized just inherently as, like, for example, Christian right groups, because we don't have a unifying church or something like that to go to. So it's harder to sort of pull people together, and it's going to require building, getting people involved with organizations and local groups and building that sort of backbone in order to build a movement. And then, using that to sort of build power through, voting campaigns, through engagement with different political parties, through investing of money. And that's a major factor as well, investment of money. Like I said, the right's been doing this for, 50 years, and we're sort of starting to play catch up. So I do hope it happens eventually. I mean, I think it will. I think it has to. But the question is, how long will it take to get there, and how do we speed things up? And I think the answers are, everyone who can should get involved with organizations and support things like building, allow them people to build infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like some of the youth are doing that. Like there are all these pockets and they're just not coming together yet. Related to that, actually directly related to what Nathan and I were writing about, one of the counter arguments that we had seen, because we argued, like, look, if you're going to pick a group that really swung the balance for Biden, you have this huge group of the irreligious who voted as a block. They're as big as Christian evangelicals. They vote as structured, like as solidly as Christian evangelicals do, except they vote for the Dems. And that's, the non-religious are doing that. And what we saw in mainstream press instead is, well, actually what did it, it's Black Christians in the South. That swings things. So that's something that's a bit outside of our ken. What do we know about, how are things different for Black atheists? Moving things to the other survey you've conducted, or the other part of it.
Sure. Sure. And I think, to be fair, both groups are necessary, right? In order to have that victory. I mean, you can take out any one of those groups and show there would be a big
Yeah,
gap. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah. But looking at the Black Non-Religious Report and Black Non-Religious Americans Report, which is also available at secularsurvey.org, this was a really terrific report. We have about a sample size of about 900 respondents. And well, I'm curious what you're interested in hearing about, because it's hard to sort of characterize it.
Oh yeah, very well. Maybe like we can start to think about the stigmas that are faced, or even where is this community? We talked to the head of the Black Non-Believers organization, and like it sounds tough. Do they face a
Yeah,
lot of social stigma?
absolutely. Yes. Black non-religious people, they're sort of double minorities, both in the atheist movement and also, being Black in America. So they're often sort of seen as not really existing or being invisible as Black atheists, and that can cause all sorts of challenges in addition to simply being an atheist in this country. As for where they're located, we found in our research that Black participants were about 1.8 times as likely to live in the South, and they're twice as likely to live in urban communities. So that's probably not surprising, but that's where people tended to be located, and more likely to be in the South and in urban communities. And we did research on, like, concealment of non-religious identity for both, for all respondents, but we found that for Black non-religious respondents, they were slightly more likely to conceal their non-religious beliefs all the time. However, they're much more likely to do so in certain circumstances. such as with their extended family, where more than half of Black non-religious participants mostly or always concealed their beliefs. So that's really substantial. And also, Black participants were 42% more likely to report that they always conceal their non-religious beliefs in 3 or more areas of their lives, compared to other participants. So 42%. So in other words, that they feel like they have to conceal uh, in different places, significant areas of their lives, and they can't really express themselves. So they're more likely to feel like concealment. I mean, that they must conceal all the time, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things I was sort of struck reading the report is just like, many people just saying how they feel very alone, like in their non-belief, like there's not, like they're the only atheist they know or something like that. And I mean, I think that's definitely a place where, aside from like advocacy work or something like that, that's another part, I guess, that atheist organizations can play, is that providing that community for people who are sort of, yeah, becoming non-religious, moving away from religion.
Absolutely. No, yeah, building community is incredibly important, and our the research actually shows that being a member of a local group and participating in some of these activities has an important protective effect. So we looked at loneliness and depression among participants, and people that face higher levels of stigma and discrimination are much more likely to have loneliness and depression. However, being a member of an atheist group, either national or local, can really make a difference and help provide some protection.
I don't know, Todd, if you have anything else on that report, or do we want to move to the
Dude,
another
I could
report?
talk about these
The,
reports all day. I have a lot of questions. I want to hear every part of it, but we know
yeah.
um, they're very rich. They're all available online as PDFs, easy to find. So, if we move on to the state of the secular state, what you're looking at states there, because this is slightly different. The other ones we were just talking about, sort of like social stigma. The state of secular states is about law and legislation and the government. What in particular are you looking at, and how bad should we feel about it?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the State of the Secular States report we're actually just released the fourth iteration of this report this month. So we've been putting it out annually since 2018. And what the report does is it looks at every single state, including DC and Puerto Rico, and all the laws and policies on the books that affect the separation of religion and government and religious equality in that state. So we're currently looking at more than 50 different legal items in every state that affect these, religious equality. And the goal here is to really provide a benchmark for what we say religious equality and separation of religion and government means. I mean, it's one thing to say we need to protect separation of religion and government, but, like, does your average advocate actually know what that means? Do we know what the laws are regarding that in your state, or how to improve them, or what to oppose or what to support? Well, this is meant to give guidance to say, well, these are the things that matter. These are what affect what we're looking at. Here's the current state of the law in your state, and here's how we can move forward and work towards improving it. So it's really challenging for state advocates to do that without any kind of roadmap, and that's what the point of this report is.
In the, I think it's in the report or the press release, there's a quote from you, Allison, saying that 2021 was the worst state legislative session for civil rights in more than a decade. How bad was it, I guess?
It was real bad. It was
Okay. All right.
yeah, so
Uh-huh.
I guess it helps to frame this a little bit earlier. If we look at 2020, there was not much happening in the states because all the state legislatures, or almost all of them, closed starting in March and just didn't open again. So there wasn't much law being made, and I think all the culture war BS got built up, and it all
All right.
flooded out in 2021.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and it's just they just went crazy, full crazy, and there was all sorts of bad legislation out there. A lot of it responding to the pandemic. And I think it was so bad really for two reasons. One is we had a new president, so they're trying to sort of change the focus, change the topic of conversation in the new administration, right? And two, because people were not having as much access to the state houses because of the pandemic. Many state houses closed entirely. Like, you couldn't get in to see hearings, you couldn't go speak with lawmakers. That sort of oversight really matters because it helps moderate people. And if you can't get access to lawmakers, they're free to just do whatever the heck they want. It's hard; they don't have public scrutiny on them. And that makes it really challenging. They're not hearing from real people about their lives. They're just sitting in their, room or whatever, writing laws, no matter how ridiculous they are or how absurd. So that's part of the problem. And we just saw these waves of negative legislation. And I'll just give you a couple examples. We saw, I think the first time I've ever seen this, there was more than 50 bills to exempt religious organizations like churches from public health laws so that they could gather, even if they said, it's not safe to gather because you're going to kill people because of the pandemic. They exempted them in numerous states or introduced laws to do so. There were also these really, really broad denial of care laws that passed in 2 states, been proposed in about maybe more than 10 others. So a denial of care law basically says that like a individual provider or a hospital does not have to provide certain types of care that conflict with their religious beliefs. Like, for example, a hospital does not have to provide abortion care. And these new bills, 2 of which pass, are so much broader. They allow the provider to deny any type of care that they disagree with, either religiously, morally, or ethically. And they not only apply to providers and hospitals, they also provide to payers, including insurers and employers. So, like, if an insurance company says, "Well, we object to you receiving that treatment for whatever reason," then they can just sort of refuse it. And so can your employer. Let's say your employer doesn't think that people that work for them should be pregnant, for example. Well, they can get out of paying for that. It's really absurd. And we haven't seen the full impact of it because it just passed last year, but it will be remarkable to see how badly this goes in those states. And one thing they haven't really thought of yet, the other side, is one thing they can do is now refuse to give healthcare to people that refuse to get a COVID vaccine.
Yeah, right.
But regardless, that's sort of besides the point. I mean, this is potential to be really devastating.
Wow. So is there anything, were there anything positive that came out of this?
Yes, there's always positive stuff, at least some. We support bills, for example, to prevent child marriage, and 2 of those passed last year, which is fantastic. There are 6 states now that prohibit child marriage, and that often happens in the context of religious cults or small religious communities, and so it's one of the reasons we oppose it.
Had that been an issue? Had there
There were
been child marriages in the U.S.?
quite a number.
Wow.
Yes, this is something people don't often know about, but over the past 20 years, I think we work with a group called Unchained at Last, and they've, I believe, tracked over 300,000 child marriages over the past 20 years. So it's quite a large number, and it happens much more frequently than one might think. It's often, unfortunate, we often see it as like an immigration loophole as well. It was a way to traffic
Mm,
people, unfortunately.
wow. So it has these, it sounds like a lot of this has like knock-on effects. These things are religiously motivated, but they have a greater effect than we would expect.
Whenever you start knocking holes into laws that are meant to protect people, then you're going to have, it's going to have repercussions beyond what you expect. And some of these laws are just so irresponsible. Like, almost half of states have passed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. And these bills, they basically say whenever the government burdens religious exercise, they have to meet this really strict test in order to do so. So it's really challenging, and it almost builds in an automatic exemption to any area of the law for these organizations unless the government can meet this test. So it's that will have repercussions because it's so broad, and it's hard to say ahead of time where it's going to apply.
And so when they do this, when there are these claims for religious exemption, there's no theology test, is there? Is there anyone like, there's no court that says you have to prove that this is part of your religious dogma? Do they go through and examine holy books to find exact?
So So
Such authority?
that's a good question. That's a good question. The courts have said that you can't question you can't question the veracity of beliefs. Like, let me give you an example. In the Hobby Lobby case at the Supreme Court, which was about the craft store Hobby Lobby, believed that certain types of contraception are actually abortion. They are not. That is objectively wrong, but it does not matter because that's what they believe. So that's an issue of veracity. However, courts can look into sincerity. So if a person suddenly develops a very convenient religious belief that allows them to opt out of something that they previously had never mentioned before and doesn't come out of anywhere, then there might be a real question about sincerity. So those are different things, and courts are more able to question sincerity. But who knows? Who knows where they're going, right? I mean, they passed a law in Kansas last year around vaccination, saying that private businesses, if they want to require workers to get vaccination, they have to grant religious exemptions, and they're not allowed to look at sincerity. So that means if anybody wants a religious exemption, they get one, even if they just made it up that day and they have no evidence of sincerity whatsoever. If there is exemptions in place, that's all it requires. And sometimes it's even broader. Like, for example, under Title IX, which has to do with sex-based discrimination, it's a federal law that applies to education organizations. If they don't even need sincerity or veracity. Basically, any religious organization is allowed to claim a exemption to Title IX based on the tenets of their religion. So as long as they can point to a tenet of their religion, they get an exemption. So there's nothing else required. So that's a really, really broad loophole built into the structure of Title IX. So that's right in the statute.
Wow. Is there anything that allows it to go the other way for atheists? How do we get exemptions?
Well, our thinking is we don't fight for exemptions because we believe the law should apply to everybody, and it should not be special custom tailored for based on people's beliefs, whether they're religious or non-religious. So we call that concept religious equality, that the government should treat everybody equally, regardless of their beliefs or lack of beliefs. And so we don't go around fighting for religious exemptions. I mean, we've actually, so we've gotten requests. I'd like to get a vaccine exemption for being an atheist. Can you do that for us? And we said no, because we're not trying to get exemptions. We're trying to say that religious beliefs should not grant one exemptions. That's not how the law should work or how a country should be run. And so, that's one way to frame it. However, if on the other hand, if religion is being given special privileges with regard to taxation or to, I don't know, display of monuments, in that case, it's a little bit different. It might be appropriate to say, well, we should recognize non-religious people too. Giving invocations is a good example of this. If they're allowing religious people to get invocations, they still should allow non-religious people to do the same. So there are circumstances which are comparable and certain circumstances which are not.
That makes more sense. That makes it much clearer. So it's based on a principle of equality before the law. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So we learned something about what a true atheist can and cannot do. So, Allison,
Well, I'm not going to be policing people's identities, but
well, maybe. This is tough to play with lawyers, but we have a lightning round game. Nathan, can you explain how can a true atheist work?
Yeah, in this case, Allison, you're sort of required to police people's identities. So the lightning round is called "Can a True Atheist?" and it's just tongue in cheek. It's not. We're not going to hold atheists to these, but it's mostly just for fun. So anyway, we'll ask a question about, can a true atheist say, "Oh my God," for example, and just give us a short answer. So we've got a couple.
You are allowed
to
defend your answer, by the way.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Okay. So to start off with a pretty easy one, maybe. Can a true atheist believe in God?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Wait, but I think you can believe in God as a figure in like a book or something, like a literary figure,
Okay.
So like a social construct, like there is a social construct that might exist, right? So
right. Okay.
So anyway, that's a little bit of context because I have to give it. I'm a lawyer.
Okay. Yes. Right. Exactly. Yes.
Okay, and the follow-up, next one, this might be a tougher one. Can a true atheist openly proclaim their beliefs without having to worry about their safety?
It depends where they live and their community. So maybe is my answer.
Where is it safe to do so? And where is it not safe?
It really does depend on where a person lives, but I mean, our report talks about this. All over the country, there are certain places, especially in the South and in areas that are more stigmatized, where people face real repercussions, discrimination, harassment, and stigma for proclaiming that they're atheists. So I would say check the report for, for
Excellent.
states. We have a ranking.
Excellent. That's right. Put the customer to work. We'll have the listeners look it up on their own time. Perfect. Nathan.
Can a true atheist attend church?
I mean, if they wanted to, sure, why not?
Okay.
Can a true atheist have over 4 children?
Yes.
Okay.
These are easy.
That was easy.
Okay. Okay. Can a true atheist get hired for a job if their CV or resume has mention of atheist activism, charity, etc.?
Well, I will tell you when I go for my next job after American, I think that they can, yes. At least that's what I tell my law clerks when after they leave time with us. Yes, I think so. I think it does depend on the type of job. I mean, certainly are jobs where it could interfere, and but it's hard to give any hard and fast rule there.
Can a true atheist eat meat?
Yes.
Ooh. There we go. Do you have numbers on that? Do you know how many are vegan or vegetarian?
Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
I have no idea. No, I don't have numbers on that,
Right.
but
Next time. We'll put that in the next survey.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this is just a sidebar, but I mean that is one thing I sort of wonder about. We had Monica Miller on a couple episodes ago from the American Humanist Association, and she's also does some work with animal rights. And it does seem, I don't know, just anecdotally, it does seem like there are more maybe vegans and vegetarians in the atheist milieu, perhaps, but yeah, that's just a speculation.
That might be possibly true, but the question was,
Yes.
can a true atheist eat meat? And the answer is
Yes.
yes.
There's
Yes,
that law
okay.
training again.
Yeah, right.
All
Yeah.
right, Allison. Can a true atheist believe in ghosts?
Well, okay, so I would say no. However, it depends on if they define ghosts in a weird way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. What would a weird way?
I don't know, just
Okay.
like an aura of like a feeling that an old place gives you or something like that. You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
this place feels haunted or those sorts of I think there might be like an emotional concept that might be relevant, but I mean ghosts are generally supernatural and
Yeah.
I don't think an atheist could really believe in that.
Yeah. You know what? That does remind me that one of the rooms in my house gets a weird smell after a while if nobody's been in it. And I've started taking it to, it's, that's the ghost, that weird smell that shows up in the room.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So now I feel
Yes.
like I can be a true atheist and admit to
You're
it.
vindicated. Yeah. Can a true atheist support the death penalty?
I think so. I think they're different. I mean, that's interesting actually, because we joined the Freedom from Religion Foundation on an amicus brief recently at the Supreme Court, and both organizations argued against the death penalty. So we have taken a stance against it, as have many major other atheist organizations. But I think one still can be an atheist and believe in the death penalty. I just think the organizations don't tend to.
And finally, can a true atheist think religion is a force for good in the world?
They can think that, but they're wrong. Yeah, I think they can. Sure. I mean, I've known atheists that have thought that.
Wow. All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to end it. We've learned a lot today. Allison, this is a lot of information. These reports are massive and they're rich and very, very illuminating onto like who we are, because we don't get to meet everyone. To have
Right.
this view of what it is, how other people feel, and to get this sense that we're not just no atoms floating in space, that we are a larger group.
Well, I wanted to give just one other note. I forgot to give the website for the State of the Secular States report. It's available at atheist.org/states.
And that'll be posted below as well. So it'll be hot linked. People can check it out there. Or anything else you'd like to plug, Allison?
No, but thank you so much for having me on. It's been fantastic.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, that was Alison Gill from American Atheists. That was a lot of fun chatting with her.
Fantastic. Some people know how to get things done, Nathan.
Yes. So what were some of your takeaways from the conversation?
I've got a few, but I wanted to know what you think, because already we've seen, look, we've got people out there doing the work that needs to be done for atheists. That's fantastic. That's the big takeaway. But yeah, Nathan, why don't you tell us what's your big takeaway from this one? What did you learn? What were you most impressed by?
I guess like you're saying, just that there are people doing this sort of work, and I was just sort of struck by one of the comments she made, and I think in a previous episode with Sarah Levin, I think she made a similar point, but that secular people have they're behind in terms of their organizing compared to like white evangelicals who've sort of been setting up this organizations and kind of political frameworks, I guess, since like the 60s. And finally, it took them, I guess, until like the 80s for them to kind of really start to flourish as a group. And I mean, and to like sort of get political power. And I think that's an interesting point. That I mean, it's not as though secular people are starting from nothing. I mean, there's organizations in place, but in terms of having, I guess, sort of like the way to kind of mobilize them politically, mobilize like this growing demographic politically is, I think it's still somewhat in its infancy, I would say. But I mean, obviously there are people who are working on doing that, turning like the demographic numbers into actually political power.
Yeah, it's a great point that it's there and it just needs to be organized. And there are institutions and organizations and people that are doing it. That's great. And like you said, like this project of Beyond Atheism, planning ahead, seeing where we're going, what it's going to be like. These points, we keep hearing the same points from different people with different perspectives. And it is starting to come together more cohesively in the same way, right? We've got the numbers, we need the political organization. The political organization with the numbers leads to power. The other thing that we've been hearing about, and it really came across today, is equality before the law, which is not something I don't occupy my time thinking about the law. But we've gotten a few examples of this on the show and a few different perspectives that really show that what atheists want, what an atheist world looks like, is a secular world where we have equality before the law. It's a form of justice, not these particular carve-outs, not exceptionalism, not privileging one particular view over another. The way we have now, the atheist world is not a world where atheism is privileged. It's a world where there is no privilege based on religious belief. Because we've heard from other groups that, like, when you don't have that, when you privilege this religious group, you let them do the invocation, you let them have prayer in school, you let them disregard laws about healthcare or women's health, that it creates real problems. And we've seen that side. And then to hear from other people about what secularism looks like and how we have to instill this principle of equality before the law. That's how it ought to work. And then connect it with what Allison was talking about, which is, hey, we're making an effort. We're going out there to make sure that there is equality upon the law. Finding an atheist organization, a group of people committed to secular principles, it really squares that circle. Like, we have it in place. We have the means to do it. It's just actually doing it now. And I think, to me, that was a clarifying moment about what the world looks like beyond atheism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it was a good way to put it. Like you said, like, not about atheist privilege, just getting rid of privilege in general.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like many of these things benefit people who are not atheists. Like they would benefit religious minorities too. I mean, like some of these laws that have been passed in various states about, allowing people to discriminate pretty much for like whatever kind of reason they want, so long as it's under the guise of like it's my religious conviction or whatever. I mean,
And you like that
yeah,
when
I
you
mean,
own the bakery, and you like
yeah,
that, right? When
right,
it's just
yeah,
when people are able to hurt the people that you hate, you agree with it.
hmm
But that
yeah,
it's some point it's going to be you, and then
yeah, exactly, yeah,
and there's an
exactly,
easier way to avoid that.
mm-hmm.
So it's great to see that coming together, and though we know that the state by state project, which is what the American Atheists are focusing on, looking at state laws. You can check out those reports. They have reports, they have actions, they have ways to join. That can be found. We'll have links below for everything, all the reports,
Yeah, yeah,
and the state of the states as well.
hmm yeah. I think, yeah, all the reports that they put out. I mean, it's really valuable. Like for one thing, to know, like, what are the challenges facing non-religious people today? Like, what are they? What are their priorities and so on? Like, what are the challenges they face? And then to know, like, from a legal perspective, like, how is it taking shape in laws? And I think it's like, to sort of advocate for a group and so on. Like you have to know sort of what the situation is.
Right? Yeah, and I mean the numbers that they find are phenomenal. You can read. They have cases of how discrimination and stigma works, measures of where the stigma where it's strongest or worst. So yeah, it's a worthy project to get behind. Definitely worth a read. They're super easy to read, lots of graphs, plenty of colors. I like that stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's fascinating to like find out like we're part of something that we all have similar experiences.
Yeah. hmm
So it
Yeah.
helps build that community. We're not alone.
Yeah. And I think it's like it's interesting too. Some of the more like zoomed in samples, I guess, of like young people and Black Americans, looking at like the specific, yeah, stuff that they experience. And then I think Allison also said there was other reports forthcoming about women, LGBT people, and I can't remember what the other one was, but yeah, I think there was one other one in there. But yeah, but I mean, it's interesting, like to sort of yeah,
Yeah, and
just
like
to
I
learn more
mean, there's
about
so
this
many
group.
numbers we can get into, and that fascinate us. Certainly, the connection between atheism and LGBTQ communities, like that is a tight link. The increasing
hmm
link between atheism and environmental consciousness is
hmm
huge,
Yeah.
right? Like there are things that they make sense, but they're also a little unexpected.
Yeah, she was saying in the one of the report about the young people, like one of the top priorities for young non-religious people is like climate change. And I mean, yeah, that's definitely interesting because it wouldn't immediately jump to mind as like, this is a like an obvious atheist issue, but it is. I mean, obviously it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas you talk to old
hmm
farts like me, and it's like, oh, you got. It says, "In God we trust" on the money. You can't have that.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
trust
Right.
God.
Right.
This is stupid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally different. I'd love to know how these generation gaps develop, how they
hmm
manifest themselves, what they look like going forward, and how we keep going
hmm
with it. Right? Does more environmentalism mean more atheism, or is it more
Mm.
atheism leads to more environmentalism?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like these are,
No, it's yeah.
they're big questions. Ooh,
hmm
yeah, things we got to look into.
Yeah. hmm Yeah.
Oh man, yeah. See, again, this is the problem with this, Nathan. Every time we start one of these things and try to focus on something, we end up talking about everything.
Yeah.
There's so much there.
Yeah. 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 That's true. I mean, I think, yeah, I think it's just something like, whereas atheism, like, it is a very narrow definition. Nonetheless, there's a whole host of issues that are brought up when you have kind of a secular atheist
Yeah,
worldview.
yeah. And this is why we're here. This is why we're doing Beyond Atheism, because it's not just religion is
Yes. Yeah.
stupid. It's a lot
Mm-hmm.
more. The world gets richer, so much richer when you cast off religion and start focusing on the world the way it is.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's true. Yeah, I guess so. We would just want to encourage everyone to check out those reports from American Atheists. We'll make sure to include the links below for all the reports, and then like the press releases too, if you want sort of the short version. Yeah, it's like a ton of interesting info, and yeah.
Yep. So thank you everyone for listening. Thanks especially go out to our Patreons, Lars, Debbie, and AHS Plus Blog. Love you guys. Thanks everybody for listening. Smash that button, pull the string. What is it? Like and subscribe. Ring the bell, and we'll talk to you later.